everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. So today we're going to be doing the first of our mini Q&As. We're going to be doing these every few weeks on this channel in order to answer your questions. So if after watching one of our videos you have any further questions, or if you have any questions or problems you're dealing with in your writing, you can leave them in the Google form linked in the description, and your question might be answered in one of these mini Q&As. So the first question here is, I'm writing a first-person novel. I'd love some advice on when it is advisable to use dialogue and action and show conversations and interactions, and when to summarize what happened next. This is a great question because it leads back to two really important writing tools, which are scene and summary, and both are really, really useful. Pretty much every scene in your story is going to be one of these two types of narrative. It's either going to be an active scene or it's going to be a summarized section, but it can be hard to know when to use each type. I think, and this isn't a hard and fast rule, but the best general rule that I can give you is that you want to show, so you want to use scene, so the, dialogue, action, and active scene for any moments where the character is being active and it's changing the outcome of the plot. So if your character is making choices, they're making active choices, and this is pushing the plot forward, changing the outcome of the story, you want that to be an active scene. But you can use summary to show moments in time where maybe the character is being passive, where the outcome of the plot isn't directly changing, and it's also really helpful to show habit or stretches of time. So if there's a period of time where pretty much every day kind of passes the same and the character falls into habit, you can summarize that period of time. Summary is really useful for kind of condensing periods of time where maybe the plot isn't directly moving. Maybe what happens is important glue to the story, but it's not an active forward step or an active beat. There are exceptions to this. Sometimes you will summarize an active moment. Sometimes you will dramatize a passive moment. But most of the time, if you're unsure, I think that's a good rule of thumb. So the next question, why do all of today's most popular contemporary writers break the rules that Reedsy swears by, especially literary fiction? In McGlue by Tessa Moshfegh, it begins, I wake up. So I wanted to field this question because I think it's an important question to cover for several reasons. The question here isn't why do certain books break the rules. I think the important thing to be asking is why do we have rules in general? And I think if we understand why do we have rules in general, and also understand that writing really doesn't have rules, and very rarely when I'm presenting any information in any of these videos, and by presenting something as a rule, most of the time it's just a best practice commonplace guideline. But it's always important to ask yourself, does this serve the story that I want to tell? And if it doesn't, you don't have to follow it. So I think the important thing to ask here is, why do we have rules? Well, typically we have rules because we're trying to avoid common problem. The rule that you're referencing, which again isn't really a rule, it's just a guideline, is that we usually say you don't want to start a story with the character waking up. And it's not because that's bad inherently. It's because the common pitfall is that a lot of new writers begin with their character waking up, and that's often not a strong start to the story because it's just quite mundane, it's quite boring. And so that's why we say don't begin with your character waking up. It's not because that is inherently bad, but because typically it has a weak effect based on how it's typically used. However, in the example you gave, which is McGlue by Tessa Moshfegh, which I haven't read in quite a while, so forgive me if my details are slightly off, but I believe it begins with the main character waking up in prison. That's quite interesting immediately, because I believe it begins with him waking up in prison and not knowing why he's there. The rule here doesn't really have to apply because the common pitfall doesn't apply. The common pitfall is beginning with your character waking up is kind of boring, it's mundane, it's not an interesting place to start a story. But in this case, it actually is an interesting place to start a story, and so we don't really have to worry about the rule. You can find this in your own writing. If you feel like there's a place where you feel like you don't want to follow a rule, and I'm putting rule in quotes, it may be because the reason why we have this rule actually doesn't apply to you. You mentioned that a lot of contemporary books, especially literary fiction, break the rules. You will find that literary fiction is less likely to follow best practice or, common guidelines. It's a genre that is rooted more in experimentation and ideas. And on this channel especially, a lot of the information is going to be kind of best practice writing craft, and that is going to apply more to genre fiction. And you are going to see genre fiction follow those guidelines more because genre fiction is tighter, it's more active, it's more plot-based, it's more structural. Those guidelines are going to apply in more cases, whereas literary fiction is more idea-based, it's more theme-based, it's more, often craft or form-based and character-based, and so a lot of these rules may not apply there. So ultimately, I wouldn't see writing craft as rules. I would just see it as craft, and you can take it or leave it. And the important thing is to understand why we have guidelines that we have and why you are applying them. If you're following a rule in your work, it's as important to ask yourself why you're following in this case as it is to ask yourself why you're breaking a rule in cases that you're breaking them. So the final question that I'm going to answer in this video is, what about dialogue? And it's, when a side character is divulging their backstory to the main character, would it still be considered infodumping to have this character explaining their past and how they came to be in that situation with the main character? Would it be ill-advised to have several pages of dialogue of this character telling their story? I don't know if this would technically be considered infodumping. I don't necessarily think this is inherently bad practice. I think, like all things related to information management, you just have to make sure that you're writing it well and doing it with care and placing it appropriately in the story so that it's contributing to building tension rather than stalling the pace. Side characters telling their backstory to the main character is often the only way that this side character's backstory can be revealed, and I will tell you that I have a scene exactly like this in my own book, so I cannot say that I think it's bad in all cases. It's often going to be the only way to communicate this information if you're in a limited point of view, so it may be necessary, and I don't think it necessarily will come across as infodumping if you write the dialogue in an engaging way, if you make use of the fact that this is an active conversation, you lean into the emotion and maybe the interaction between these characters. Now, if it starts to feel very expository and it starts to feel maybe too convenient, then it may start to feel like an info dump just because it's not being handled well. But I don't think a scene like this is inherently a bad idea or bad practice. I think, like all things, it just needs to be appropriately placed in the story and written with care to the craft. So those are all the questions I'm going to cover in this video. So if you want your question to be answered in one of these videos, you can leave it in the Google form linked in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Friday on this channel. Until next time, bye!